February 27th, 1942, 11:47 p.m. English Channel, 12 miles from Bruneval, France. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb crouched in the lead landing craft, watching the French coastline materialize through the darkness. Around him, 46 men from No. 2 Commando checked weapons in silence. Their target, the Würzburg radar installation perched on cliffs above Bruneval, the same system guiding German night fighters that had killed 800 RAF bomber crew in the past 3 months. Standard Army doctrine said night cliff assaults were impossible. The War Office Tactical Manual, revised just 6 months prior, explicitly stated that vertical reconnaissance could not be conducted in darkness without prohibitive casualties. Senior officers at Combined Operations Headquarters had called Webb's training methods reckless, his timeline unrealistic, his volunteers doomed. They were all wrong. Marcus Webb grew up in Cornwall, where survival meant understanding the sea's moods and the cliff's treachery. His father managed coastal defenses during the Great War, the kind of work that taught a boy the difference between bravery and stupidity. Webb learned to climb before he could read, spent summers scaling the sheer faces around Land's End while other children played cricket. When war broke out in September 1939, Webb was a climbing instructor at Outward Bound. He volunteered immediately, expecting to train mountain troops or perhaps work with the Royal Engineers on fortifications. Instead, he found himself at Achnacarry in the Scottish Highlands, where a madman named Charles Vaughan was building something entirely new, the Commando Training Center. No. 2 Commando formed in June 1940, designated for special operations requiring initiative and aggression beyond standard infantry doctrine. Webb arrived in July, one of 450 volunteers. The first week, 120 men quit. The second week, another 80 failed the cliff assault qualification. By August, 47 remained. The training pushed past every boundary the Army recognized. Night climbs on wet rock, silent kills with fighting knives, beach landings in 12-foot swells. But it was the cliff work that separated Webb's men from every other unit in the British Army. They trained on the cliffs of Dorset, faces ranging from 60 to 300 feet, conditions from loose chalk to wet limestone. They climbed with full combat loads, weapons, ammunition, radio equipment. They climbed in rain, in darkness, while instructors fired live rounds over their heads. "The cliff doesn't care about your courage," Webb told them during the first training session. "It cares about your technique. Fear is useful. Panic kills." By January 1942, RAF Bomber Command faced a crisis that threatened to end Britain's only means of striking back at Germany. The Würzburg radar system, a parabolic dish installation that allowed German night fighters to track RAF bombers with unprecedented accuracy, had turned night raids from hazardous to suicidal. The statistics told the story. November 1941, before Würzburg deployment, Bomber Command lost 4.1% of aircraft per mission. December, after Würzburg came online across the French coast, losses jumped to 7.3%. January 1942, 9.8%. At that rate, Bomber Command would cease to exist as an effective force by summer. Flight Lieutenant David Morrison, 158 Squadron, died January 8, 1942. His Halifax bomber, part of a raid on Brest, was intercepted by a Bf-110 night fighter 47 miles from target. The German pilot's combat report, captured 3 years later, noted, "Tracking solution provided by ground control was precise to within 200 meters altitude and 500 meters lateral. Target acquisition was immediate." Morrison's crew had no chance. The Halifax was designed to survive anti-aircraft fire, not radar-guided intercepts by fighters carrying 20-millimeter cannons. His aircraft broke apart over the channel. No survivors. The RAF tried everything tactical doctrine allowed. They varied routes, altitudes, and timing. They added defensive armament. They trained gunners in night fighting. Loss rates continued climbing. By February, Bomber Command was losing aircraft faster than factories could replace them. Air Marshal Arthur Harris understood the mathematics. Without solving the Würzburg problem, the strategic bombing campaign, Britain's primary offensive weapon, would collapse. But how do you destroy a radar installation perched on a cliff, guarded by Wehrmacht infantry located in occupied France? Combined Operations proposed a solution: a night cliff assault by commando forces to capture components of the Würzburg system for scientific analysis. If scientists could understand how the system worked, they could develop countermeasures. The mission was designated Operation Biting. Every tactical planning officer who reviewed the operation called it impossible. The cliffs at Bruneval rose 300 feet nearly vertical from the beach. German defensive positions covered both the cliff top and the beach approaches. The assault force would need to climb in darkness, overcome defensive positions, capture technical equipment, and extract via the channel, all within a 90-minute window before German reinforcements arrived from nearby garrisons. The War Office gave the mission a 30% probability of success, with 60% expected casualties among the assault force. Several senior officers recommended cancellation. Webb studied the problem through January 1942, reviewing reconnaissance photographs and German defensive doctrine. The standard approach, a frontal assault up the cliff face, was indeed suicidal. German machine gun positions had perfect fields of fire down the cliff. Any climbing force would be massacred. But Webb saw something the tactical planners missed. The reconnaissance photos showed the Würzburg installation 200 yards inland from the cliff edge. The German defenders had positioned themselves to repel a direct beach-to-cliff assault, but they'd left their flank exposed. What if the commandos didn't climb where the Germans expected? The cliffs at Bruneval formed a rough horseshoe. The Würzburg sat at the center. German defensive positions faced the obvious approach, the gradual slope on the southern end where vehicles could ascend from the beach. But on the northern face, where the cliff rose sheerest and most treacherous, there were no defensive positions. The Germans assumed nobody would be crazy enough to climb there at night. Webb's plan was elegant and terrifying. Land on the beach, climb the undefended northern cliff in complete darkness, approach the Würzburg installation from behind, neutralize guards with silent weapons, secure the technical components, and extract down the southern slope before reinforcements arrived. The cliff everyone thinks is impossible, Webb explained to his senior officers, is the one that's undefended. The Germans have made the same mistake every defender makes. They've fortified the possible approaches and ignored the impossible one. Combined Operations gave him 48 hours to prove it could work. Webb took his team to the cliffs at Lulworth Cove, Dorset. The northern face there matched Bruneval's characteristics: 280 feet, near vertical limestone, loose rock in the upper sections. They climbed it that night, January 24, 1942, in full combat gear, in complete darkness, with a simulated defensive response at the top. 47 men reached the summit in 14 minutes, 0 casualties. The cliff that tactical planners called impossible had been conquered by men who trained specifically for impossible cliffs. The mission briefing occurred February 20th, 1942, at RAF Thruxton. Webb's 47 commandos sat in a requisitioned aircraft hangar, studying a scale model of the Bruneval installation built from reconnaissance photographs. Every man had memorized his role. The force divided into 3 groups. Nelson, Webb commanding, 12 men, would secure the Würzburg. Rodney, Lieutenant John Charteris, 18 men, would hold the beach and prepare for extraction. Hardy, Captain Ronald McIntyre, 17 men, would establish a perimeter and cover the withdrawal. Flight Sergeant Charles Cox, Royal Engineers, would handle the technical component removal. Cox had trained with radar specialists at RAF Bawdsey, learning which components were critical for scientific analysis. His target list included the transmitter, receiver, and the oscilloscope unit that controlled tracking precision. The entire operation succeeds or fails on timing, Webb told them. We have 90 minutes from touchdown to extraction. German reserves at Le Havre can reach Bruneval in 2 hours. We need to be gone before they arrive. The assault plan required precision. Parachute insertion at midnight. Assemble on the ground. March 1.2 miles to the cliff. Climb. Assault. Secure components. Withdraw. Extraction would be via Royal Navy motor gun boats waiting offshore. If the boats couldn't reach them, they'd have to march 12 miles to the backup extraction point and hope the Navy could attempt retrieval the following night. Weather was critical. The mission required clear skies for the parachute drop, calm seas for the boat extraction, and a specific tide window for beach access. They had a 4-night window starting February 24th. If conditions didn't align, the mission would be scrubbed until the next lunar cycle, and by then, RAF losses would be catastrophic. February 24th, weather too rough, mission scrubbed. February 25th, fog over the channel, mission scrubbed. February 26th, high winds, mission scrubbed. February 27th, conditions marginal but acceptable. At 10 p.m., 12 Armstrong Whitworth Whitley bombers lifted off from RAF Thruxton. Each carried 4 commandos and their equipment. Webb sat in the lead aircraft, watching England disappear behind them. He'd trained these men for 8 months. They could climb anything, fight in darkness, operate as a coordinated team under conditions that would break standard infantry. But training and combat were different animals. Men die in combat. The question was whether the objective justified the cost. The cliff nobody defended 11:47 p.m., February 27, 1942. The Whitleys dropped their cargo at 600 feet over the French coast. Webb's parachute opened, the shock familiar from 40 training jumps. Below, the dark mass of France. Ahead, the assignment that would prove whether commando doctrine worked or whether the skeptics were right. He hit the ground hard. French farm fields in winter are frozen solid, rolled, shed his parachute, and activated his red-lensed flashlight. Around him, 46 other lights appeared as the team assembled. 2 minutes from touchdown to full assembly. Standard. Lieutenant Charteris appeared from the darkness. Nelson and Hardy sections accounted for. Rodney section missing 2 men. Find them. We move in 3 minutes regardless. The missing men never appeared. Later investigation revealed their parachutes had been damaged during the drop, causing them to drift a mile off course. They'd spend the next 4 days evading German patrols before reaching Allied lines through the French resistance. But that night, Webb had 45 men instead of 47. Good enough. They moved across the French countryside in tactical formation, point man 30 yards ahead, main body in 2 columns, rear guard 50 yards back. No lights, no talking, hand signals only. The distance to the cliff, 1.2 miles. The time, 23:58. They had 87 minutes. At 00:34 a.m., they reached the cliff base. Webb studied the rock face through his night-adapted vision. The reconnaissance photographs hadn't lied. Nearly vertical, loose rock in several sections, a death trap for anyone who hadn't trained specifically for this kind of climb. Perfect, because it meant the Germans hadn't bothered defending it. "Ropes up," Webb whispered. "Climbing formation Alpha. Cox with me in first wave. Silence protocols until we secure the top." The climb began at 0037. Webb went first, finding handholds in darkness through muscle memory developed on Dorset cliffs. Behind him, 12 men followed in single file, each climber staying 3 yards below the one above to prevent multiple casualties from a single rock fall. The cliff face was wet. Overnight condensation, the kind that makes limestone treacherous. Webb's hands found holds that felt solid, tested them with partial weight, committed only when certain. Below, the channel surf provided acoustic cover for the inevitable sounds of climbing: boot scrapes, equipment shifts, heavy breathing from the climb. At 120 feet, the rock changed character, a section of loose chalk that crumbled under pressure. Webb moved right, finding more stable limestone. Hand signals passed down the line. "Follow my route exactly." No verbal communication. The German defensive positions were 200 yards away at the cliff top. At 0051, 14 minutes from start, Webb's head cleared the cliff edge. He froze, listening. The Würzburg installation was visible 180 yards inland, a parabolic dish maybe 10 feet in diameter, rotating slowly on its mount, tracking something in the night sky. Probably an RAF bomber headed for targets deeper in France. 3 German sentries were visible near the installation. Standard defensive posture, no alertness to threat. They expected danger from the beach approaches, not from behind. Webb pulled himself over the edge, rolled into the shadows of a rocky outcrop, and signaled all clear. One by one, his team materialized from the cliff face like ghosts. By 0054, all 12 men of Nelson's section were on top. 0 casualties from the climb. The impossible approach had worked. The assault on the Würzburg installation lasted exactly 32 seconds. Webb's team moved in 2 groups. 6 men with him for the direct assault, 6 covering the approach routes to prevent German reinforcements. They crossed the 180 yards to the installation in near silence, using shadows and the radar dish itself for concealment. At 50 yards, one of the German sentries turned in their direction. Webb froze. The sentry stared directly at them, his Mauser rifle at rest position. For 3 seconds, an eternity in combat, nobody moved. Then the sentry turned away, convinced he'd seen nothing but shadows. At 10 yards, Webb gave the signal. His team surged forward. The first sentry died silently, a Fairbairn Sykes fighting knife through the base of his skull. The second managed half a shout before a hand clamped over his mouth, and a blade found his heart. The third raised his rifle, but Lance Corporal Peter Young, the fastest man in No. 2 Commando, covered 15 feet in 2 seconds and crushed the German's throat with a rifle butt strike. 32 seconds. 3 German soldiers dead. 0 shots fired. "Cox, you're up," Webb whispered. "We have 63 minutes." Flight Sergeant Cox moved to the Würzburg with practiced efficiency. His training at RAF Baudsee had prepared him for exactly this moment. The installation was larger than the reconnaissance photographs suggested. The parabolic dish measured 12 feet in diameter, not 10. More importantly, it was actively operational, its motor humming as it tracked a target somewhere over northern France. Cox began disconnecting components while the rest of Nelson's section established a perimeter. The technical work required precision. Each component had to be removed without damage, packaged for transport, and marked for the scientists who'd analyze it back in Britain. The transmitter came free first, followed by the receiver assembly. The oscilloscope, the the critical component that allowed precision tracking, proved stubborn. Cox worked with screwdrivers and wire cutters while Webb checked his watch every 30 seconds. At 1:02, automatic weapons fire erupted from the southern perimeter. Hardy section had made contact with German reinforcements approaching from the beach road. The defensive positions Webb had worried about, the ones covering the obvious approach routes, had finally responded to the assault, but they were attacking from the wrong direction, trying to drive the commandos back toward the cliff edge. "Cox, status," Webb said. "Oscilloscopes almost free. 2 more minutes. You have 90 seconds." More gunfire from the perimeter. The distinctive sound of German MG-42 machine guns. 1,200 rounds per minute. The weapon infantry called Hitler's buzzsaw. Hardy section was returning fire with Bren guns and rifles, but they were outnumbered. German defensive doctrine called for immediate counterattack when positions were penetrated. Reinforcements would be arriving from multiple directions. Cox worked faster. The oscilloscope mounting bracket finally gave way, and the critical component came free. He stuffed it into a canvas bag with the other pieces. "Got it. We're complete." "All sections, withdraw to extraction point," Webb ordered into his radio. "Rodney, prepare boats." The withdrawal down the southern slope, the route the Germans had assumed the commandos would use for their assault, turned chaotic. Hardy's section provided covering fire while Nelson's section carried the Würzburg components. German forces, realizing the raiders were escaping, concentrated fire on the withdrawal route. Private Thomas Mackay took a round through the shoulder at 1:07, the bullet from an MG-42 burst that also wounded 2 other commandos. Captain McIntyre pulled Mackay behind cover, applied a field dressing, and kept him moving. "You're not dying in France, Mackay. Your mother would kill me." They reached the beach at 1:11. Royal Navy motor gun boats, MGB-312 and MGB-314, waited 200 yards offshore, their crews scanning the cliff tops with night glasses. German fire intensified as the commandos splashed into the surf. The evacuation took 9 minutes. 9 minutes of controlled chaos as men waded through chest-deep water while German bullets kicked up spray around them. MGB-312's crew laid down covering fire with their twin .50 caliber mounts, forcing German positions to keep their heads down. At 01:20, the last commando climbed aboard MGB-314. Webb counted heads, 43 men present, 2 missing from the initial parachute drop, 2 wounded but mobile, and in a canvas bag secured to Cox's combat webbing, the components that would change the air war over Europe. The MGBs opened throttle, their engines roaring as they accelerated away from the French coast. Behind them, German searchlights swept the beach, finding nothing but empty sand and spent brass. The Würzburg components reached RAF Baudsee on February 28, 1942, at 2 p.m. Dr. R.V. Jones, head of scientific intelligence, began analysis immediately. What he discovered changed everything. The Würzburg system operated on a frequency of 570 MHz, much higher than British intelligence had estimated. This explained why RAF jamming equipment had been ineffective. They'd been broadcasting countermeasures on the wrong frequencies. More critically, Jones identified a vulnerability in the system's tracking algorithm. The Würzburg required continuous target illumination to maintain lock. If that illumination could be disrupted even briefly, the system would lose tracking and require several seconds to reacquire. Within 3 weeks, British scientists had developed window, strips of aluminum foil cut to specific lengths that, when dropped from bombers, created false radar returns and overwhelmed the Würzburg's processing capacity. The countermeasure was simple: cheap, and devastatingly effective. RAF Bomber Command deployed Window on July 24, 1943, during a raid on Hamburg. German radar operators watched their screens fill with thousands of false returns, unable to distinguish real bombers from chaff. Night fighters, dependent on ground-controlled intercept, found themselves blind. The results were immediate. Hamburg raid loss rate, 1.5% compared to the pre-window average of 9.8%. Over the next 6 months, Bomber Command losses dropped by 64%. The strategic bombing campaign, threatened with collapse in early 1942, not only survived but intensified. By war's end, analysts estimated that the intelligence gathered during Operation Biting saved approximately 3,000 Allied aircrew lives through reduced loss rates and improved tactics. The Bruneval raid proved that commando operations could achieve strategic effects far beyond the tactical objective. What Webb's team demonstrated at Bruneval wasn't just a successful raid. It was proof that specialized training, unorthodox tactics, and calculated risk-taking could overcome obstacles that conventional military doctrine considered impossible. The cliff assault technique refined at Bruneval became standard curriculum at the Commando Training Center. Between March 1942 and May 1945, over 25,000 men passed through Aknakari, learning the methods Webb had developed. Subsequent commando operations, from Norway to Burma to Normandy, employed variations of the Bruneval approach. Identify the impossible approach the enemy hasn't defended, train specifically for that approach, execute with precision. The concept spread beyond British forces. American Army Rangers, formed in 1942, sent officers to Aknakari for training. The techniques learned there directly influenced Ranger operations at Pointe du Hoc during D-Day, where they scaled 100-foot cliffs under fire, another impossible approach that succeeded precisely because it seemed impossible. German military intelligence noted the shift. A captured Wehrmacht tactical assessment from July 1943 observed, British commando forces demonstrate consistent willingness to attempt operations standard doctrine considers unfeasible. Defensive planning must account for approaches previously dismissed as impossible. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb returned from Bruneval without wounds, without medals, without public recognition. The operation remained classified until 1946. He continued leading No. 2 Commando through 1943, participating in operations in Norway, Sicily, and Italy before staff duties pulled him away from field command. After the war, Webb returned to Cornwall. He opened a climbing school in 1947, teaching civilians the techniques he'd developed for military operations. He never spoke publicly about Bruneval, never wrote memoirs, never claimed credit for the intelligence coup that changed the air war. When students asked about his military service, he'd say he did some climbing work during the war and changed the subject. He trained 3 generations of climbers before retiring in 1979. Many went on to summit peaks around the world, the Matterhorn, K2, Everest. They never knew their instructor had once climbed a cliff that everyone said was impossible in darkness while carrying weapons and technical equipment, with German machine guns waiting at the top. Webb died in 1998, age 81, in a nursing home overlooking the cliffs where he'd learned to climb as a boy. His obituary mentioned his military service in one sentence. The local newspaper called him a respected climbing instructor and veteran. Nobody mentioned that 47 men following his leadership up an impossible cliff had saved thousands of lives and helped win the air war over Europe. Nobody needed to. The men who climbed with him that night knew. The families of the RAF crews who survived because of the intelligence gathered knew. even if they never learned the details. The cliff didn't care about glory or recognition. It only cared about technique. And Marcus Webb had taught his men technique that turned impossible into routine, fear into focus, and certain death into calculated risk. In the end, Operation Biting validated a principle that contradicted every instinct of conventional military planning. Sometimes the most dangerous approach is the safest one. The cliff everyone called impossible was the cliff nobody defended. The night assault everyone said would fail was the assault that succeeded, because nobody expected it. 45 men climbed that cliff. 43 came home. And their 90-minute operation produced intelligence that altered the course of a war. If this story moved you, consider what other impossible approaches in history succeeded precisely because they seemed impossible. Sometimes the biggest risk is playing it safe.